Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for having this hearing. Thank you to all of the witnesses for being here and for your expertise and commitment on this issue. Charleston, 2015, Charlottesville, 2017, Pittsburgh, 2018, Poway, 2019, Dallas, 2019, Gilroy, 2019, El Paso, 2019. These are just a few of the cities impacted by domestic terrorist attacks in recent years, and they all have one thing in common. None of the perpetrators of these attacks were under FBI investigation at the time of the attack. Earlier this year, FBI Director Christopher Wray told Congress that there is a persistent, pervasive threat, his words, posed by white supremacist violence. So I want to piggyback a little bit on what Senator Portman and Senator Johnson was just asking you, Mr. Watts. I have deep concerns that the federal government does not understand the full scope of the threat, and given current legal and resource constraints, is limited in its ability to prevent future attacks. Mr. Watts, you've written that quote, short of violence or a fully approved domestic terrorism investigation, preventing white supremacist terrorist attacks becomes nearly impossible for investigators. And that's a little bit about what you've just been talking about. So that's obviously a startling revelation, and I just want to give you an opportunity to continue the discussion that we've just started. Can you expand on how current laws may constrain domestic terrorist investigations, and how do these constraints both impact the FBI's understanding of the threat and impact resources dedicated to preventing the threat?
Yes, thanks, Senator. So there's a couple things to consider. One, without a designation or opening of a nationwide case.
Right.
So you could do that either, and he'll be much better, Mr. Chesney, at explaining the legal, parameters around that. But without a domestic terrorist organization designation or the opening of a nationwide case based on a violent ideology, there's no central repository to collect or even count on or do counts, measure statistics. We have to rely on Bill and George to tell us statistics because there's nothing really to harness that information. It could be a civil rights in one jurisdiction. It could be a domestic terrorism viewed threat in another, or a firearms violation. So there's no way to really get your hands around what the scale or scope of the threat is. I actually go to outside researchers. Moonshot CVE does national maps. I could pick out jurisdictions. I think I have that map even here. I brought it with me. But I could go to these jurisdictions and I'd be like, none of these red dots are surprises to me.
Yep.
We have had many cases over the years of violence. The same thing in the online space. I could tell you there's a significant white supremacist threat after Christchurch, just in terms of the online uploads of that video. Right. 1.2 million stopped at the time of upload, I think, at Facebook. 300,000 more, taken off. That means that, I call it the iceberg theory. That means under the surface, you have a massive support network online around the world and in the United States. It's helping boost that ideology, which is going to further inflame and increase the pace of attacks, which is directly what you're talking about with those incidents. It also creates commonality around targets. So synagogues, African-American churches, mosque, Hispanic locations with a Walmart. Those all have commonalities because the movement now collectively is starting to direct in terms of the targeting. The problem for the FBI is without some sort of designation or some nationwide case, there's no way for analysts or even investigators to report centrally in. When I was a brand new agent, we would report all Sunni violent extremism to one operational analytical unit. They would then analyze it. They would make connections and parse out leads to other investigators. At this point, it's almost impossible for a domestic terrorism investigator in the FBI or DHS who's out there on their own to really piece it together. They almost have to do it in a grassroots way throughout the organization. So there has to be some sort of designation and measurement, but also to help those investigators be more preemptive. And I think the other part is we know where they're at, right? It's not just these locations. It's Gab. It's Telegram. And if I were trying to close on those, I wouldn't ask anybody in government. There are researchers outside in public that I would go to that could tell me exactly what's going on in those environments. I feel like the federal investigators are way more limited in that regard.
That is helpful. And I'm going to submit for the record a question to you, too, about the way we could improve information sharing state, local, federal, similar to what we do for foreign terrorism. But I wanted to turn to Mr. Chesney because you had referenced to Mr. Watts about the legal impediments we have that make it so hard for us not only to gather the information, but then to really prevent this kind of terrorism. So I'd just like you to expand on your previous answers and help us understand that.
Thank you, Senator. So I would argue that it's not really a legal constraint. It's a question of commitments, it's cultural perceptions within the agencies about what's in scope, what's out of scope, and so forth. And here's why I say that. Maybe we should disaggregate the problems a little bit. One of the questions is, can we get the national coordination that we need to have in some, but though definitely not all cases, but in some cases. There's not a legal obstacle to doing that, I believe. There's nothing in the Constitution that would preclude that. I don't think we have any statutory obstacles. Right. It's an internal organizational question about.
Can I just, I think what I'm trying to get at, though, is in your testimony, you've indicated that there are gaps in terrorism law that impact domestic terrorism charges. So can we focus on that?
Sure. Okay. So setting aside investigation.
Yeah.
I argue in my testimony, in my remarks, that we should close the gap in the scope of substantive federal criminal law to reach gun-based terrorist attacks that would have been, if carried out with explosives, within the scope of the so-called and misnamed WMD statute. Yeah. That's the major gap. I also argue that actually the scope of federal criminal law is much broader in this area than many people appreciate already.
Okay. That is helpful. I have more questions, but with only 30 seconds, I think I will turn it back to the chair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I will just observe, too, that after 9/11, we put together a real counterterrorism architecture that allowed for some of the kind of information sharing that we're talking about at the domestic level that isn't happening and hasn't been resourced. So I hope we can focus on that moving forward, because I think that that's one of the real deficits we've been talking about. The quick question I had was for you, Mr. Salim, because 2 weeks ago, we were all in New York City right before 9/11 having a field hearing at the National Memorial and Museum, which was an extraordinary place, and it was, thank you to both the chair and the ranking member, a wonderful and important opportunity. We had 3 former DHS secretaries there, and one of the things we talked about with them was about the recent rise in threats against and attacks on houses of worship across the country. I think everybody agrees no one, regardless of their faith, should fear for their lives when they go to their house of worship. That's where we want them to feel safest, and that's where they should be safest. Your organization has recorded 1,879 anti-Semitic incidents in the United States just in 2018, including the deadly attacks in Pittsburgh, not to mention the attack earlier this year in Poway. In New Hampshire, one rabbi noted to me that now they only open the doors to her temple shortly before services begin, and they lock the doors shortly after the start of services. As she leads her congregation during those minutes when the doors are open, she says she wonders, is this the night we die? So, Mr. Salim, can you share with me your thoughts about how Congress, the Department of Homeland Security, and the entire federal government can work with law enforcement and community organizations to keep soft targets like houses of worship safe from threats? I worked with Senator Portman on getting grants to houses of worship of all sizes in all communities, because New Hampshire's a small state, we're a rural place. We don't always qualify for the big urban grants. But what else can we be doing to work to really keep soft targets like these safer?
Senator, thank you for your question, and thank you for making such a sober point in this testimony about the fear that really tears at the fabric of faith-based communities across this country. It's very real, and it's something that many communities live with on a day-to-day basis. For context, even going back to pre-9/11, for more than 3 decades, ADL has been a leader on the issue of security for communal organizations, especially for schools and synagogues. And it's obvious, just based on your question, that the Jewish community and the data that ADL has recorded in 2017 with a 57% increase and anti-Semitic incidents across the country has been a significant target of hate crimes and bias-motivated crimes. The FBI and DOJ's own data for calendar year 2017 shows a 17% increase in hate crime surge across the United States. It's so important that as we think about protecting any house of worship or any faith-based or vulnerable community in this country, irrespective of race, religion, ideology, or sexual orientation, that we're doing so mindful of the threat environment that we're in today. And so one of the things that ADL has continued to lead, and we welcome partnership with other governmental and non-governmental organizations, is working to increase the awareness of the threat environment, as well as partnering with organizations that do teaching and education on preventing targeted violence and mass attacks across the United States. I think much of the work that's come out of the federal government in this regard for teaching, training, education, and partnerships across faith and community-based groups has been foundational, but much more resources and personnel need to go into these efforts to increase a state of preparedness, if you will, across all communities that could be vulnerable.
Thank you very much, and Mr. Chair, thank you for your indulgence.